45 per week.
45 hours a week, and you get 5 rands for that?
Yes, 5 rand for that. 4 rand, other one get 4 rand, other one get 3 rand.
4 rand in English money is around about £2 a week you get?
Yes.
You can't say we're not supposed to do We're not supposed to tell you anything.
This video is about the 1973 strikes that took place in Durban and the surrounding areas. Thousands of workers down to tools, bringing work to a standstill in a number of factories, the municipal services and the docks. The 10th 1973 strikes came after more than a decade of no significant labor activity. The strikes marked the rebirth of the progressive trade union movement, a movement that was to take up the struggle of the majority of South African people against racist and capitalist exploitation. Workers who were involved in the strikes recalled what happened. Ufile umuntu, ufile usadekile were the angry words chanted by the striking coronation brick and tile workers as they marched from the hostels to work at 3 a.m. on the morning of January 9, 1973. Here we have Johnson Kaba, who was working at Coronation in 1973 when the strikes took place.
The strikes started after we were not satisfied with our wages. We were earning peanuts at Coronation. When I started working at Coronation, I was earning just R6.70 a week. Some workers were earning R10, depending on their experience. We needed an increase. For that reason, we wanted Coronation to add a little more whenever wages were increased. The workers from Briardin then realized that we had to unite and ask the company to give us more money so that those that were paid the least would earn at least 10 rand or more than that per week. The reason for us to go on strike was because there was no one representing us as workers. Beside the wage issue, treatment at Coronation at the time was not good at all. They used to employ about 200 people a week, but you will find that the following week they would all be gone. And only about 10 of the 200 would be left. The bosses did not take responsibility for any accident taking place in the workplace. The bosses claim that those workers who got involved in an accident in the workplace were stupid. Workers were not compensated for injuries. They just dressed the injured area with bandages.
The day before the coronation strikes began, it was said that management had distributed pamphlets warning workers not to involve themselves in the strike or they would be severely punished. They claimed that there were communist agitators behind the strike.
That means all of us who were involved in that strike were communists. I don't think a finger can be pointed at any individual.
The first day went by without any consensus being reached between management and workers. That evening, when workers were marching from Avoca to Bradin, they came across Kingswell 10 of the Zulus. Many workers at Coronation were from Kwanongoma, the place of the king. They told the king what had happened. He promised to visit the factory the following day to speak to management on their behalf.
On the following day, at 7, we met again, preparing for departure. On entering the main road, we found the traffic cops and the South African police, who led us and controlled the traffic until we reached Bradin. When we had gathered at Bradin, the king arrived. He asked us whether we had workers' representatives, as there were so many of us. The response was no. We had never even thought there could be representatives who would speak on behalf of workers.
Nathaniel Zulu, another worker at Coronation, confirms the spontaneity of the strike. He became a spokesperson for the workers. When the strike started, he was staying in Guamash.
I was coming to work in the morning, not knowing what had happened. I found the place deserted. I saw Mr. Fox, the transport manager, waving at me. I went to him. He told me that there was a strike going on and that all the workers had gathered in the soccer field at Bradin. Yes, I can still remember. You know, it takes time for an unenjoyable experience to be forgotten. It happened that when I arrived at the soccer field at Bradin, I found workers I could estimate at 8,000 gathered. When it was time to start work, the managers came. They were thinking they could solve the problem there and then. They told us to go back to work. And the workers said, "We want money."
Management would not listen to the workers. Management asked the workers to elect a committee to represent them. Workers were scared that those elected would be victimized.
At 9 a.m. the following morning, the king arrived. We told His Majesty our problem. I had to explain to him the working conditions in the company. I told him about how badly we were treated by management. The king advised us to form a workers' representative committee, which would serve as a channel of communication between management and workers. After the formation of the committee, negotiations with management started. We negotiated with the company for various benefits. Those who were working night shift were supposed to get a night shift allowance. and those working in the kilns were to get a heating allowance. Transport allowance and many other benefits we had not had before were obtained. We went on to talk about increasing wages. The starting wage was increased to R8.50 a week.
After we've got increase, we decided to go to work the following day. This was the third day.
The strike at Coronation inspired many workers to take similar action throughout Natal. News headlines reflected that more than 100 factories were hit by strikes. At 7 a.m. on the 10th of January, on the second day of the Coronation strike, workers at AJ Killer, a transport company in Durban, went on strike demanding wage increases. The strike was unsuccessful and lasted for only 45 minutes. Another strike broke at TW Beckett and Company, a tea firm in Durban. Workers wanted an increase of R3 a week. More than 100 workers were sacked. On the 15th of January, more than 100 ship painters and cleaners went on strike at AJ Architect and Company in Durban. Workers were demanding an increase of R30 a week. Mr. Architect, director of the company, said they can wait until doomsday. They'll never get it. There were rumors that the company was considering using convict labor to replace striking workers. On the 22nd of January, more than 200 African drivers were reported to be picketing outside Motovia, a car-ferrying company in Pinetown. They were demanding R40 a week. They were fired. Replacement drivers were brought in from the Pretoria and Bloemfontein depots of the company. Once they reached Pinetown, they also joined in the strike. The massive frame factories in Jacobs and New German areas, Pinetex, Frametex, Celtex, Notex, and Natal Knitting Mills also joined the strike. Frame also has factories in other parts of South Africa. Tenjiwe Diwa is working for Celtex in New Germany, one of the companies in the Frame Group. She started working there in 1972.
We were complaining about money. Wages were very low. If I'm not mistaken, we were earning R5 a week. 5 cents was taken from one's wages for the doctor's fee. We realized that we could not survive on that. It was very little. We lodged our complaint with management, who did not want to consider it. We realized that there was only one alternative left for us. That was to strike. We decided to go on strike. We went to Frametex and Notex to stop those who were working. Those who continued working while we were on strike were called scabs. In that strike, some of us were detained. We heard that the strike was illegal. Some of us were beaten by police dogs. We found ourselves surrounded by police.
Only Africans went on strike. Other race groups were working.
Kwakungabantu abamnyama bodwa babekhona estrike. Ngoba abanye babehamba bayokusebenza bona.
The person who spoke on our behalf was B.I. Dadla. He became our hero. He spoke to management. Management agreed to accept our demand. In July, wages were increased to 7 rand.
Dolly Lungwana started working at Pintex in New Germany in 1916. She was there when the strike started.
I still remember the beginning of the 1972 strike. We wanted wage increases. Only 10 cents was added and we went on strike. Besides low wages, there was a lot of victimization in the company. Whenever one went on maternity leave, that would mean one had retrenched oneself. If your manager did not like you, you will be easily dismissed. There were no unions and the bosses did not want them. When chaos broke out in our section, all the others would be informed. Were paid the same wages. When wages are increased, they are increased for the whole complex. The whole New Germany complex went on strike.
Who represented the workers if there were no unions?
The liaison committee, which was appointed by management, were not satisfied with the liaison committee because it tended to favor management most of the time.
Obed Zuma worked for Frame until 1972. When the Frame strike started in 1973, he was working at Smith & Nephew in Pinetown. He became very active in the strikes and in organizing workers in Smith & Nephew. He was later elected to be the General Secretary of the National Union of Textile Workers, the NUTW, an African trade union that was formed in that year. Working conditions were very bad. Wages were low. Companies were paying different wages. The textile industry paid the lowest wages. Within the textile industry, Frame was paying the lowest wages. Yes, working conditions were really bad and the wages low. Frame had a reputation of bad labor relations. Initially, Frame used to employ a great number of men. As time went on, a lot of male workers were retrenched. They were replaced by women because women could be paid lower than men. At that time, women workers were getting about R5.75 a week. Frame recruited in rural areas. They attracted people by promising them work, food, and accommodation. The recruits were transported to the cities by bus and train. The destination was Celtex in New Germany. From Celtex, they were dispatched to other sister companies in New Germany and in Jacobs. On their first day, they were offered tea and bread at the canteen at lunchtime. After they were registered, they were told to go to Claremont and Dassenhoek to look for accommodation. It happened that the company would make arrangements with landlords in places like Dassenhoek, Claremont, and St. Gwendolyn's, where slums were developing.
The landowner would offer accommodation at a rent he favored.
When workers went on strike, which political leaders supported them?
Yeah.
The strikes took different forms. For example, at coronation, King Zwelithini of the Zulus went to speak to the bosses. That caused conflict between him and the Wazulu government. The Wazulu government was saying the king should not involve himself in such matters. They, as His Majesty's councillors, were responsible for speaking on behalf of workers. When the strikes started in other industries, Pani Dladla, who was in the Department of Internal Affairs in the Wazulu government, played a very important role in assisting workers, especially in the textile industry. 2 or 3 days after workers had donned tools in the frame group, they gathered at the Claremont Stadium. Pani Dladla addressed them and then led them on foot from the stadium to the frame plant in New Germany. When they arrived at the frame plant, they found the gates locked. Management said, "You are not coming in." And Pani said, "I am coming in." They finally let him inside. Whenever Pani was called, he would address the workers, listen what their grievances were, and find ways of meeting with management and present workers' grievances to the bosses. Negotiations would then take place and agreements would be entered into.
Crucial services were brought to a halt in the city of Durban on the 5th of January when more than 12,000 municipal workers went on strike for higher wages. The whole city became littered. Toilets were left to stink. Parks were left untended. The supply of meat, fruit and vegetables to the market was affected. Funerals were delayed as there was no one to dig the graves. White citizens volunteered to help at the market. The municipal workers' strike was one of the biggest strikes to take place in Durban in 1973. The strike spread as far afield as Northern Natal. On the 12th of March, about 2,500 workers at the Sapi paper mill in Mandini went on strike for higher wages. On the evening of Sunday, the 25th of March, about 500 workers went on strike for higher wages at Alusaf, a giant aluminium smelter in Richards Bay. The strikes had an effect even beyond South Africa's borders. A crew working for a British cargo ship went on strike over their wages while they were in Sweden. Their action brought international attention to the strikes. Enoch Mabaso came from Waswaiman, a rural area outside Pietermaritzburg, to look for work in the Greater Durban area. He later found a job at Glacier Bearings in Westmead, Pinetown. He was there when workers at Glacier Bearings went on strike.
I started working at Glacier Bearings on the 2nd of November 1972.
Was it easy to get jobs?
There were jobs, but they were available for people who were from Pinetown district. Those who were not from Pinetown could only get jobs as cleaners, in the flats, in the construction industry, or in security companies. The employers could fire people anytime without a hearing. Workers had no way to defend themselves against dismissal.
Besides wages, what were the other reasons for the strike?
Working conditions inside the factory were a reason for the strike. The workers had no way to put forward their complaints. The complaints were put forward through the headman, and the headman would not pass them on the employer because he was fearing for his position. Before we went on strike, some union organizers used to visit us. After the strike that happened at Coronation and Frame, Alpheus Mteto, David Hampson and David Davis and others would come to the factory, and the employer would chase them away and warn us not to talk to them because they were communists. He told us that we were earning enough money, we should not listen to them. If we had a problem, we must come and speak to him. The workers decided that they should go on strike because they were promised that there would be a wage increase in January. But when it was in January, they were promised February. We said that we couldn't wait for February. We want money now. The employers did increase our wages. The only problem that we had was that we were not clear on how the wage should be increased. We had asked for wages to be increased to 25 rand. And when the employers asked what about those workers who were already earning 25 rand, we couldn't respond.
The strikes were largely Natal-based. They did not spread to other areas in South Africa. David Hampson, a union organizer with the Registered Textile Workers Union in the 1970s, puts forward this possible explanation.
In Durban and in the sort of this area on towards the coast, the factories, the large factories in the industrial areas of Durban, included more African workers who were actually doing the job. I noticed this when I went up to Joburg, that you still found metal factories where white workers were basically doing most of the production, and the African workers were sweeping and cleaning and doing sort of semi-skilled work, but not really the job that determined the future of that factory. Whereas in Natal, and particularly in Durban, it was very different. So you had more African workers actually really doing the job. Look at the dockers. They actually make those goods moved in and out of the harbour. They were absolutely crucial to production. Not sweeping the harbour. They're not doing anything else. They are the workers. The same in the textile factories. The same in the metal factories. So African workers felt we are it. We are the productive force of the society, and we demand to be recognised.
The 1973 strikes happened at a time of a political vacuum in South Africa. The only African people's organizations, the ANC and the PAC, were banned. Although there was an attempt to revive SACTU, repression drove the organization underground. David Hampson explains the political situation during the 1973 period.
There was no one behind the strikes. There was no single person. But it was quite a mixture of different influences and activities. Now, looking at the landscape at that time, we had Steve Biko here in Durban, and all the development of black consciousness, which was a very important intellectual ferment among black intelligentsia. At the same time, we had developments taking place in the Indian community with the revival of the NIC, Natal Indian Congress. In the unions, we had people like Harriet Bolton, who was light years ahead of trade unionists in other areas. So we had a lot of very unusual developments taking place. There was also a revival of SACTU at that time.
The Begisisa Nxasana, an ANC and SACTU stalwart, was actively involved in the revival of the trade union movement in the early 70s.
Workers' unions were allowed because there was no law which prevented them from operating. But the conditions were made so difficult that they could not operate well under the Industrial Conciliation Act of 1956. This law was passed precisely to destroy all African trade unions. The minister put it clear, saying, "I want to bleed the African trade union to death."
Under these conditions, many African workers believed they were not allowed to join trade unions.
There was no union because black workers were not allowed to join unions. Only Indians, whites, and colored were allowed to join unions. The Labor Department was dealing with the issues of black workers. There was a white guy from the Labor Department who was called a representative of black workers. But we first saw him when we went on strike. And when we asked him, "Who are you?" he told us that he was from the government department. He told us to stop striking.
In this particular repressive context, students of the University of Natal formed the Wages Commission, which became involved in helping workers with work-related problems. Begisisa Nxasana remembers the Wages Commission.
As far as I know, the Wages Commission was formed by the students who were NUSAS members. NUSAS was a highly political student organization, and their ideas were in favor of socialism. Through the Wages Commission, they were able to express these ideas, which exposed the exploitation of black workers. They were also better placed because they could even go to the factories and tell the employers that they were students of the University of Natal and that they were conducting research. They would then collect the pay slips of workers. After checking the pay slips, they found a lot of irregularities. They went to their offices to do some in-depth investigation. Due to those efforts, workers' morale was boosted. A lot of workers began to come to our offices and demanded to join SACTU. It was in that time that the students decided to form the benefit fund, which was known as the General Factory Workers Benefit Fund. The workers were paying weekly subscriptions to the benefit fund. In return, they would get death benefit. But the whole idea behind the formation of the benefit fund was to mobilize workers.
The idea of benefit fund came about through a discussion. I forget who really put the last word on it, but Halton and I studied the history of the British trade unions, and they started out as benefit funds. You see, first of all, as sick funds, of unemployment funds, helping workers when they're in trouble. And with such repression in South Africa, you'd go to an African worker and say, "Hey, how about starting trade unions?" And they'd look at you and say, "Look, I'm very busy. I'll see you another time." Basically, the atmosphere was so strained, it was so uptight, that very few African workers were prepared to say, "Yes, of course we want trade unions," although they all wanted them. And then the confidence was built to use the benefit fund to say, "Okay, we're confident enough, we're launching a trade union now, and the benefit fund can fade away." But it took actually the workers in the frame factories in Pinetown, the women workers actually to break the logjam. Because the African men workers that we met, many of whom were stalwarts in the past of the ANC, were very, very nervous about this whole thing. But then when the women workers took it up, they would say to the men, we are for the union. Men, are you for the union? You know? And they would shame the male workers into going for it. And
the struggle for higher wages and improved conditions developed into a struggle for trade union recognition. Different strategies were used to organize workers into the trade union movement as we know it today.
During our time, one couldn't just go to the gate and distribute pamphlets and recruit workers into the union. One had to wake up very early in the morning and go and hide in a nearby bush, where one's contacts would call workers to whom one would speak and recruit. After the work was done, the organizer would then take his own way home, and the workers would go back to work. Even when doing lunch hour visits, we had to hide in the bush. Workers in that particular company would inform their colleagues to come to us so that we could organize them. At Frame, the union card was called Benye Benye, so that others could not understand what we were talking about.
The strategy that we were using was that the substrat of the unregistered union, that was the African Textile Workers Industrial Union, worked together with the substrat of registered union. They would formulate a strategy to confront the employers. Then the substrat of the registered union would go to the employers with the mandate of all the workers. That means that the Indian workers would represent us after we had discussed the issues.
As the majority of African workers had been organized into progressive non-racial trade unions, the struggle became over the recognition of that particular union.
Our union was NUTW. There were two unions in our company. The other one was the TWIU. They called themselves Red Card and were Blue Card. Were different. The difference was that TWIU agreed to everything the bosses were saying. Ours was called a bush union. Management liked TWIU. Members of NUTW were harassed because of their membership and could be dismissed anyhow. It was not until we were the majority that they were compelled to recognize our union.
It was easy in foreign companies like Smith and Nephew. There was pressure from the mother countries complaining that these companies came to South Africa to exploit African workers. As a result, the EEC Code and the Sullivan Code of America were established. Because Frame was a South African company, it was difficult to argue for trade union recognition. African trade unions were something new at that time. The government was fighting them, the bosses were fighting them, and the corps were also fighting them.
NUTW was finally recognized at Smith and Nephew in 1974. Workers were jubilant at the major success the unions were able to achieve in the factories throughout the country.
We gained a lot when we had a union. When there was no union, we gained nothing. Chaos always broke out when we wanted higher wages.
There is a lot of change. Would not be here if it had not been for the union. There is a lot. Paid maternity leave, service bonus, annual bonus, bursaries for dependents, wage agreements for increases in January and July. A lot was done by the union at Frame.
Workers are convinced that the strong trade union movement they have today was born out of the 1973 strikes. In the early 70s, workers were so oppressed that they thought it was illegal to form trade unions. At that time, the Industrial Consolidation Act was in operation. The law did not ban African trade unions, but at the same time did not give Africans the status of employees. Their trade unions would therefore not be recognized. It was high time that they defied government legislation. In most factories, the strikes were successful. Workers gained increases in their wages. They then waged the struggle for the recognition of their trade unions. A general union was formed in that year called the Transport and General Workers Union, which gave birth to the National Union of Textile Workers, Metal and Allied Workers Union, Furniture and Timber Workers Union, Chemical Workers Industrial Union, which were industrial unions. It, however, took time for the government to pass a law that recognized African trade unions. It was only after the Vienna Commission in 1979 that African trade unions were recognized. Nevertheless, African workers had already started using their unions without any recognition by the government.
That's right.